Et c'est parti, Chantal. Great. Um, the big concept is, if we're all different, should we teach to a group or should we teach to a collection of individuals? And as we'll see a bit from this presentation, there are some strategies to try and be as inclusive as possible without generating an overload of effort for teachers, because you're already very solicited as it is with your current teaching practice. One of the key trends we're seeing in education, and we've been talking about it a lot in the College Network for the past few years, is universal design for learning. Um, as you may have heard before, this concept or approach to designing learning is derived from architecture. The idea being that all buildings should be accessible, have ramps for people that have reduced mobility, and by designing buildings this way, we're actually helping different people with different needs. Think about the overloaded person trying to deliver something to a building. They're just as happy to have a button to press on to open the doors and have ramps towards the building as others. So with universal design for learning, it's a little bit the same idea. While you're trying to include and anticipate the needs of a variety of students who may or may not have disabilities, you're also helping more broadly different styles of learners with their learning preferences by designing to those needs. And in the documentation about UDL, which is mostly prepared by an organization called CAST, we see that we want to provide multiple means of representation for information, different ways of engaging the student, and having different means of expression. You should also think maybe about different communities of learners when designing learning. For example, people from First Nations, Aboriginal learners may have different learning needs, and we're seeing a number of projects that are trying to be more inclusive with the history and culture of Native peoples. There's also a significant number of immigrant people in Montreal and large centres across Quebec. Are we catering to their particular needs? There are, of course, students that have learning disabilities or special needs that we can design for. There are people with different learner types and preferences, people who are more visual or prefer things to learn things kinesthetically. So how can we design learning for them? And also a more recent phenomenon is we've seen very high levels of anxiety in students. So can we design our teaching and learning in such a way that we reduce the anxiety of students? I just wanted to show a couple of examples of things that are happening in the College Network. Heritage College in Gatineau a few months ago put a new section of their website up called the Indigenizing Project, where they are making a commitment to have more Native content within their curriculum. So on the left you see a screenshot from that. Closer to home at Dawson College, you have the excellent team at AdaptTech, who maintains a database of accessible technologies and publishes a number of studies to help teachers learn about and apply UDL concepts. And they recently conducted focus groups on the accessibility of PowerPoint presentations. Some very fascinating results from that study. And that's an organization you have working within your own walls. And so I've just put a report cover from one of their studies on blending universal design, e-learning, and information and communication technologies. And this is just a quote from that report. The proactive application of universal design has the potential to reduce the need for disability-related accommodations and expand access to learning for all students. That's from a study by Fauvet and Mole that was cited within the study at AdaptTech. One of the other trends that we're seeing in the province currently is a push to collect more data on student achievement, student interactions within learning management systems, etc. And this has an incidence on something called adaptive learning that I'll touch on in a second. Um, the Horizon Report 2018 is a report that comes out on an annual basis that talks about emerging technologies, trends in the short, medium, and long term. And analytics and adaptive learning were identified as one of the key areas that will be growing in the next 3 to 5 years. The idea is we can collect data, but we also need to make sense of it. What do different interactions with the platforms mean? How much time are students spending in Moodle, for example? When are they studying? These are all things that we're seeking to understand. But there's also a Canadian researcher named Stephen Downes, who's a co-inventor of the MOOC, the Massive Open Online Course, who wonders how we can also collect what's happening outside of learning platforms in the classroom and elsewhere to help push learning. We also need to capture this data in different ways, and he started to consider different ways that this could happen. Once you collect data and you make sense of it, the next logical step is to be able to adapt the learning path to the needs of the students and prioritize different interventions. We attended, Raphael and I, a presentation a couple of years ago by La Cité Collégiale in Ottawa, where they have an early warning system for students that are at risk of dropping out or failing, and students are flagged in a dashboard type interface, and teachers are given this data so that they can intervene with their students and hopefully prevent them from having any future difficulties. So these are the type of things that are going on. And of course, that won't replace the sort of proximity that teachers have with students and going with your gut, observing the body language and the interactions with the students. You'll probably detect just as well as any machine that there may be something up with one of your students. And again, a local example of a project that's taking place. I attended 2017 PED Day at Dawson last October, and Samir and Jonathan, two teachers and coordinators at Dawson, presented work that they had done over the summer to create a program analytics framework for Dawson College, which looked at the different programs and at Dawson College using data available from Skytech's databases and Dawson College's databases to sort of have some predictive analysis about some situations where students maybe need extra effort or reinforcement and things like that. So I actually ended up writing a ProfWeb article on this groundbreaking project. So things are happening. And a quote from that was, by presenting the data in a visual way, you will begin to see the big picture and be able to identify the problems, things that are working, things that are not working. And if you're not looking at the data, you're flying in the dark. So this is speaking to the potential of harvesting student data in order to be able to cater our interventions in the future. One of the other things that we're seeing a little bit across Canada, in fact, is the emergence of personal and informal learning. We have seen a number of MOOCs being created both in Quebec and elsewhere. There is increasingly open educational resources that are created by one or many colleagues that are posted online that can be reused. One example of the OERs that are very well known, maybe they're not so open, but they're online learning resources, are the Khan Academy tutorials, for example. So we see these type of video tutorials. There's also, I would say, a value in this sort of sporadic learning of students. We see a lot of students supplementing their learning with resources on the internet. So And I think we as well, as educators and just as human beings, we're also part of this trend. I guess I'd ask the question, how many of you have gone on YouTube to see a how-to video or a recipe or just a fix-it type video instead of calling your neighbor or asking a friend to try and figure things out? I think it's the sort of new way of micro-learning. And a lot of these sort of learning objects are just in time. You go and find them when you need them. But one of the challenges of this supplementing of the learning is how do we recognize and incentivize students to augment their learning in the classroom with these type of things? Is there a way that we can recognize this informal learning and the initiative of the students to try and better understand different concepts? So that's one of the things that we'll be looking at in the next few years. And there's actually some badging projects happening currently in Quebec. I think I have an example in the next slide. Oh, it's a little bit later on. One of the things that I had mentioned earlier in the presentation was Stephen Downs was wondering how can we aggregate information that doesn't happen inside Moodle, for example, so that we have a larger picture of the type of learning, whether formal or informal, that students are doing. And he created a little system called Grasshopper that aggregates information from his different personal website. He scoops information from different websites as part of his personal learning practice, and he puts them in this sort of this software that gathers all this data, and it helps him have a portrait of his own personal learning projects. So he's made the source available on GitHub. If anyone's interested in checking that out, you can go look for it on GitHub. For him, the benefit, he says, I can track my own progress both inside my courses and in the work I do in my community of learning because my personal learning environment is connected. And just some more things that are happening in the province in this sort of area. Yeah, there's LaSalle College just down the street from Dawson that has created one of their first open textbooks in physical education. They made that available to students to help reduce the cost of their education, and they're able to cater that particular textbook to their particular needs at LaSalle College. In the middle, we see the CERES database that's at ceres.vteducation.org. Where they have a catalog of learning objects that are available and sorted based on taxonomies from the Ministry of Education for the different programs. So if you're, for example, in nursing, you can go and look for resources, learning objects, media links, things of that nature on their website. And in the current digital action plan from the government of Quebec, they're looking at different platforms that can aggregate content as part of a structured push to help us share resources across colleges in the future. And the third example I alluded to earlier, it's a screenshot from the IT Representatives Network. It's the REPTIC that has a community that is trying to work on badging as a way of recognizing learning for students for their informal learning of gap training. In order to do this, many times you'll need a learning management system to host this material, such as Moodle or Leia. And these systems can provide you with analytics which can drive next generation adaptive learning. So based on your performance and you can have pre and post tests and things like that, but based on the machine's analysis of your strengths, it can generate a learning path that's more catered to your gaps and what you need to learn. And then following that, there's also the question of assessment and the use of e-portfolios with digital badging and learning analytics coming out of learning management systems, a demonstration of student progression. All of these ideas help give a better idea of the whole student. And in this year's Horizon report, they talk about something called the T-shaped student. This is a quote from the report. It says that employers are increasingly seeking what is called the T-shaped graduate, a combination of deep vertical knowledge in a particular domain with a broad set of horizontal soft skills such as teamwork, communication, facility with data and technology, and appreciation of diverse cultures and advanced literacy skills. So that sort of feeds into the e-portfolio and the digital badging as a means of showing this sort of T-shaped nature of the students. And then with informal learning, which is the other point of convergence, also in the Horizon report, there's a suggestion that we may witness in the next few years the rise of a new sort of transcript, which includes things like soft skills, digital badges. I believe there's already been an effort for volunteering situations at the elementary and secondary levels to integrate some aspects of that into the transcripts. So this is something we may see in the next few years is in terms of convergence. So I sort of presented all those different pieces separately, but I think I hope I've demonstrated a little bit that there's overlap between all of these areas. So we need to think when we're doing one thing, how it may impact some of the other areas we're trying to develop at the same time. And maybe thinking about these things in advance will help us to have a more coherent approach to development in the next few years. So just a couple fun slides. What is the future with all of this convergence, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and things like that? Here is one of the websites of the Treasury Board of Quebec. And as you can see, they have web standards for multimedia that are official across the board for the government, but I think education sector will also be submitted and required to ensure that their online content is accessible to learners with different needs and perhaps visual or auditory impairments. This is all coming. And it's easier to develop it upfront rather than going back and changing things later on. Just a wink at some of our early promotional material from Cégep at Distance. This whole concept of studying when and where you want may apply for some of the aspects of a blended learning approach where teachers are assigning some things that can be done at a distance and saving in-class time for other pursuits, and trying to encourage a deeper learning in the classroom through practical application of knowledge. And this is also fun and scary at the same time. Microsoft has developed an API that has machines detect the emotion of people that are on a webcam viewing content, and they've been able to identify, based on the shape of the face and things like that, varying degrees of emotion. And in the slide you see anger, contempt, disgust, fear, happiness, neutral, sadness, or surprise. Unfortunately, there's more negative emotions than positive that can be detected by this technology, but things are getting a little crazy and a bit scary, I guess, in the field of convergence. So the last few minutes of this presentation were intended more for discussing some of the issues, and I have a few questions that I was going to post for people to discuss within the class. But before I go any further, does anyone have any other comments or questions?
Oui, oui. Donc, c'est le cours de recherche qui est développé